Anatomy of the Soul by Calatrove. For Talon Thomas, with love. Prologue. High above the city of London, hidden behind sentinel walls, is a piece of England like no other. It is the most stately, the most rambling, a tangle of Victorian grandeur, heavily haunted and utterly haunting. It is the west side of Highgate Cemetery, and it is also my home. The mansion of the Lord has many rooms, and so does ours, with as many states of being contained within. To the estate agent, the property was a dilemma of disrepair and disrepute, immune even to the euphemisms of his trade, twice condemned and in the 60s, perpetually under a fug of exorcists' incense. To me, it is a dream house, a manifestation of conscious desires delivered by subconscious propulsion. That means spell given. This house has its own cosmology, and like the mansion of the Lord, its essence contains all that has ever been and all that ever will be. But mainly, and most visibly, it harbours us, the de Bonneval family. Meet my husband Ben, tall, dark and handsome, just the way I summoned him to be. However, he's not a mystic, as I had specified. The gods give us so much that we ask, but there must always be a random element, apparently, however adept the sorceress. No, Ben is a surgeon, a performer of anatomical rather than astral miracles. He saves lives, and that's no mean magic, is it? He also loses them occasionally. And on those days, the children and I endeavour not to come out with our favourite teas. If you hadn't been a surgeon, you'd have been a serial killer. Ben loves his work, the flesh and bones and gristle of it, and a slight difference in temperament might have made him a very dangerous man indeed. Still, there are days when he would not see the funny side of our parallel life jest, and days when he does. As it is, the open body is a canvas to him, and he casts himself as artful conservationist. He studies the original style of the work, which he grasps through conversing with the patient prior to each operation. He thinks about the meaning of the oeuvre in the grander scheme of things. Anatomy of the soul, he calls it. And then he breathes new life into his subject, surgically. Like any couple, we have our contretemps, and our household is not without its tribulations. The most obvious factor is that Ben doesn't believe in what the children and I know to be true. He's a rationalist, dedicated to keeping people on this side of the veil for as long as possible, while we, on the other hand, are creatures of ellipses, with no predictable full stops to contain us. The most boundary-defying de Bonneval is Louisa, our firstborn, a child blessed with the unnerving ability to compare us to all the other parents she's ever had. A child who, at the tender age of 3, informed us as we drove in Paris past the old site of the Moulin Rouge that I used to dance there when I was a big girl. As infanta, she took her long-term memories lightly, chit-chatting about them until her guileless banter got her into predicaments at school. It was a shock to her to discover that other children could barely strain their fragile minds back to this crèche, never mind those belonging to other centuries. Louisa looks as I did in my teens, stick-thin, with gypsy skin, cali black hair, and eyes that glow green when her emotions are up and her psychism high. Purple and black striped tights, baggy black jumpers and workman's boots. She's that kind of girl. She comes across to strangers as a solitary soul, for they cannot see the spirit parade that walks behind her at all hours of the day and night. Rosa came after Louisa, a China doll crossed with the Chinese god of good luck. Porcelain skin, silky dark hair, and a belly full of laughs. Rotund and jolly, yet delicate-looking, Rosa knows instinctively how to do parties, people, food, and despite her thickness of limb, sports. Wiry Louisa, lithe as a gazelle, has not the urge to compete at such fripperies, as she calls them. So Rosa always won their childish games, and thus, perhaps, gained the confidence to think she might win outside the home too. As a consequence, she often does. Rosa is always to be found in hooded tops, usually promoting some new metal band or other, and trousers so long and flared, or baggy with hanging appendages, that their ends are in complete tatters. She refuses to wear anything that isn't at least 3 sizes too big for her, with the exception of the occasional vest top. Like any mother, I would love to see her in something more feminine. She has never voluntarily worn a skirt, or shoes rather than sneakers. But I suppose there's plenty of time for that later on. She's been a member of this family for 14 years thus far. She's more like her father than the rest of us, and though she has the sight, she has as yet indicated no desire to use it. Rosa is probably the closest we get to normal, and this is perfectly deliberate on her part. Lastly, but not least, meet Julian. He arrived 20 minutes after Rosa, but in no other way is Julian her twin. I had never intended to call a son of mine by that name, but the first moment I saw him, I knew he could be known by no other. He's been Julian always. A classical mind demands such an appellation. Julian is an absurdly dignified child, positively regal, even in diapers. Quiet, intellectual, bends air in those respects, a straight-A student with a spine to match, and a chin held as if there were holly tied to his throat. Louisa likes him. There is a mutual respect between the quieter siblings. But Rosa, warm and gregarious as she is, and ever keen to normalize, is a child alone in this house. As to the leading lady on the set, raising her children amidst the catacombs of the Victorian elite, that would be I, Anastasia. You will learn more about me as we explore the mansion, its environs, and inhabitants. Highgate Village, where we live, nestles between the affluent Muswell Hill and Finchley in North London. Its greatest attraction to non-residents is its unique Victorian cemetery, in which are interred luminaries as various as Karl Marx, the pre-Raphaelite muse Lizzie Siddal, and the first openly lesbian author, Radcliffe Hall. It contains a remarkable Street of the Dead, the obelisked Egyptian Avenue, a dark, straight path flanked with looming front doors, each marked with the name of the inhabitants and the address of their previous abode in the outside world. Prestigious addresses, all of them, now relocated to a world swathed with ivy and cobwebs. These doors are black and emblazoned with torches, but their black flames burn downwards. In each door is a working keyhole, but that too is upside down. The life force is reversed here, and the residents sleep the eternal sleep, or at least their bodies do. At the end of the Egyptian Avenue is a hill, atop it a great cedar, centuries old. This provides the main view from our breakfast room. We peer out over our fruit and yogurt to observe that all around the sunken base of the hill are more and more black doors, a corridor of death encircling the lofty cedar. It's the perfect morning tonic, and one of which the Victorians themselves would have approved. Death in life and life in death. As above, so below. Beyond and above this hilltop, exceeded in height only by the ancient tree, are the mausoleums of the Victorian greats. Inventors, writers, founders, each immortalized in death by their own affluence in life, caught in financial amber. The dense shadows of their memorials fall into the circle, at least when the sun is at certain angles, demanding recognition, just as they did when striding this earth. Troops of tourists are led halfway round the catacombs on the hour by sensible-shoed ladies with walkie-talkies. Otherwise, all is quiet. It is sometimes so quiet that I can hear the ashes in the caskets shifting in the breeze. The first of London's cremated are here, in a latticed columbarium at the back of the circle. Most of Highgate's interred rest in one piece, however. In the higher areas, the more recently committed lie amidst exquisite clod and root, thankful perhaps for whatever legacy got them that plot. They should be. They are the latest and last additions to the 167,000 other of our immediate and blessed neighbours. Neither love nor money nor Hades himself can get you in there now. Those living in this postal district are almost invariably creative, professional, middle class and upwards, politically correct and left-wing. My father would have called them educated trendies. We are no exception in many respects, and luckily, the compulsory tolerance of our neighbours prevents them from either complaining or, hopefully, caring about our idiosyncrasies. While my husband mends bodies, I do my best with minds and souls. If I tell you we live in a converted mortuary, you will most probably recoil in horror, but let me assure you that this place ostensibly of death is full of vibrant spiritual and physical life. There's not a space in civilization, or certainly in England, that hasn't had somebody in it, living, laughing, but most likely suffering. The fact that ours once contained vacant bodies bothers us not in the least. The house is shaped like a crucifix. It was originally one story, that being all that the morticians required, but Ben and I built upwards. Because it is sheltered by horse chestnut and oak trees, planning permission was granted without trouble. I think the cemetery owners were relieved to have the building off their hands. Nobody else wanted it. Until we bought it, it was used as a storeroom for rusted gardeners' tools and moulded, broken headstones. One of the wonderful things about the Victorians was their sense of the epic, the mythic. Our driveway is flanked by 4 stony ladies, whose moss and lichen-dappled faces change with the time of day and the season, the latter being what they represent. The dour look on cowled Hecate's face is enough to keep burglars and, originally I suppose, body snatchers and necrophiliacs from the door. Though shaped like the instrument of Christ's torture and our supposed redemption, the outside of the building features medieval-style grotesques, gargoyles and green men in the eaves and gutterings. When the owl hoots from the cedar in the Lebanon Circle at night, it is audible all over the house, owing to some strange acoustic dynamic. We have allowed the creepers from the cemetery to hold their embrace on what is now our property. Or rather, I have managed to persuade Ben that the feeling of being knitted to our neighbours is essential to my enjoyment of the situation. I wanted a house with 10 spare rooms, 1 for each Sephira. I like my Kabbalah, but what with 3 children and the need for a consultation room for my clients and so forth, we ended up with only 7 to spare. So I improvised and themed each room according to a very specific atmosphere and process. The house is a psychic digestive system. It takes all manner of properties from the outside world and transforms them into exact, usable energies. So we have the Kali room, the Shiva room, the Isis room, the Lakshmi room, and Kabbalistically, the Yesod, Netzach, and Tifereth rooms. I have transformed the attic into the Catheric suite. Each of these rooms has been consecrated to a particular psychic and psychological process and put in kilter with that wavelength. Every object in it is honed to that purpose, every shape and nuance and colour. I encourage the children to use them as temples, and they do from time to time. The Kali room, where anger is vented, bloodlust slaked, revenge set into motion, is particularly popular with my teens. The Netzach room is painted green, and yes, the fixtures are copper. A statue of Haniel, sculpted by Roman, the love of my lives, more about him later, graces the back wall, and candelabrum of 7 clusters drip with red and green and purple wax. Creativity is born here, and love. The room looks out onto an old apple tree, which we naturally refer to as the tree of life. I think it important for the children to encounter spirit in the midst of everyday life, Kether in Malkuth, so every room of the house is assigned to a particular energy field, even if that energy is mundane, such as in the eating and washing rooms. These are just as important, the functions of Malkuth. The bathroom is a feat of engineering prowess. I can boast of that because I merely designed it. How they managed to get the show on the road, I just can't imagine. But I live with the effects, and that is quite a wonderful thing. Light shines through slabs of gemstone in the ceiling and the bath so that one can bathe or shower in ruby, emerald, amethyst light, whichever colour is required for chakric and meditational purposes. Aromas of relevance are issued simultaneously. For example, the amethyst light is accompanied by a choice of jasmine or rosemary, both being lunar scents relevant to Yesod and the third eye chakra. I am lucky to have been able to make my house my castle, as the saying goes. It is a place in which interior design meets Crowley's 777, meets the Necronomicon over the garden wall. And this is where I raise my brood of strangelings, as Ben affectionately calls the kids, and where the karmically challenged and chakra-sick of London come for consultations and healing. I run a chakra clinic in which I attempt to align higher self with lower self, life plan with day-to-day living, and other feats of balance, which ought to be easy, but alas, are all too often not. I do this both for the carnate and the disembodied. There isn't much I can't make a decent stab at from this vantage point, high up on Highgate Hill, behind these sentinel walls clad in ivy and provenance. The essential thesis of my practice is that everything is sacred, nothing superfluous or wrong. A pretty wild philosophy, I know, to adhere to in this world, where so much seems random, chaotic, or evil. But it comes from practice, which, as we all know, makes perfect. Ben takes bone and molds it, takes tumour and removes it, fixes artery and muscle and sinew. The clots which I remove are emotional, the tumours karmic. I selected the mortuary to live in because of the analogy it provides for my work. The autopsy room has become a living room, and the former pathology unit is now a wine cellar. On the wall, over stacks of fine vintages, is a blackboard showing information on how much various bodily organs should weigh. We've kept the liver section visible amidst the bottles. We use the mortuary slab, marble with a plug for leakages, as a coffee table. This sits in the centre of my consultation room. I cleansed it with salt and auric ajax, of course, but not too much. I like the fact that the body was cut up by Kali's blades, deconstructed by time and by the orthodoxy before being recommitted to the earth and the cosmic recycling process. It is intended to remind my clients that their material situations are transitory. The light from the atrium window used to be an ivy-broken promise, a bleak psalm of salvation filtering through the outstretched arms of a tacky plaster saint. Now I've replaced that unconvinced saint hanging from a rusty hook with a live choir of angels, the Aralim, and the light which falls into our house like a sword of deliverance in the darkness of death, and of death in life, is pagan green, Gawain green, a verdant eternal pentagram of knotted futurity no less. But I sound as if I'm trying to convince you, as if you were some potential client or company or some such, which isn't at all what I want. Please just take us as we are. My language may be at times florid, in the manner typical of old kind, but my life and that of my family is ultra-modern. So never mind the light from the atrium window, the grotesques and the guardian angels. My apologies, at times I must reel myself in. I love this place, so let me take you on a free guided tour of my family and our recent development. Chapter 1. Louisa. Like me, Louisa began to astrally project around the age of 13. At first, her trips out of her body were what I would call average aerial experiences, travelling at high speed over dramatic landscapes, sometimes of this world, sometimes from others. Geographical stuff. That's how we all begin, and it's good practice, if of no especial import. Then they began to develop into encounters with other entities. It's a live chat room out there for those who can and dare, but participants exchange energy rather than abbreviated words and icons. Before very long, much of Louisa's life, certainly the social portion of it, was taking place when she was out of her body. This is a frequent occurrence in teenagers, though rarely is it recognized as such by the participant or her more physical companions. They are thought to be living in a fantasy world, retreating from reality when in fact they are just beginning to approach it. Louisa, like many others, slipped into different realities with more ease and confidence than she stepped into the street. Already, she was the perfect little witch, complete with her train of invisible familiars. Although she was never my petite fille as such, being born too jaded to appreciate such frivolities as childhood, she became a teenager par excellence, with ups and downs so high and low that it made me dizzy just watching her moods swing. She would be one moment cast down as life's unwilling bride. In a reversal of the norm, marriage to Hades would seem to her a blessed relief. The next on the ascent, her spirit levitating up above the cemetery, with pure power shining from her Haniel green eyes, scaring the ghosts. The angel of love and growth visited her often, as did his sister of sorrow and dissolution. My teenage daughter became a real spitfire of a spiritual microcosm, in whom the lightning flash of being zigzagged maniacally between the pillars of mercy and severity. Poor Louisa and poor Julian and poor me, such agonies and ecstasies as the old ones suffer. Indescribable, incroyable, terrible. Please, dear reader, excuse my occasional outbreaks into French. That delectable language has been my mode of expression in several lives, and such a rich and descriptive one that I cannot help but borrow its rhythms and assonances and vocabulary from time to time. Alors, it was quite ordinary to see, with psychic vision, Louisa floating around with her feet a few inches off the ground, when dreams were in her head and poetry in her blood, and the light was shining into her receptive mind. If a rapport with another had increased her spiritual static, her aura would crackle along the corridors and spark against the heavy curtains of our home. All children are psychic batteries, especially teenagers, and we were accustomed to Louisa's projections. C'était normal. When Louisa got a Saturday job at the local antiquarian bookshop, Malinowski's, I was delighted. It seemed to suit her perfectly, and it meant that Ben and I had to give her money far less often. I did not resent the 10s and 20s in the least, but it seemed to me more dignified that she was earning her CD and tattoo money on her own. She applied for it because she had always loved that shop, and because the books in it were special to her. Malinowski's is the only place to go in North London for tomes on the occult, and she was well known to the owner and his assistants before she got the job. She was fond of acquiring old books on magic, over which Julian also pored. Mr. Malinowski seemed to me a decent chap. I had been aware of him for many a year, my own interests being concurrent with his own. Apparently he is a Kabbalist, like me, though I have never really had a conversation with him about it. I liked his white hair and violet blue eyes, the aromatic tobacco smoke of which he always smelled, bought his books from time to time in the knowledge that he too knew a little about me and the clinic, and that was that. More usually, I found myself chatting with Lauren, the manager in situ. Through Louisa, however, we got into a bit more of a regular rapport. Simultaneously, Louisa changed. I say changed, but what I really mean is that she became more intensely herself. I liked it at first, seeing my quiet daughter becoming suddenly more confident, more beautiful. She emanated more and was astrally more present. This much was good, but then there were the hours, even the entire days, that she would be holed up in her black and metal room, entranced by the Ethernet either literally or metaphorically. What occurred behind that door was uncertain, for I would never spy on my children, but she would emerge when necessary, either full of the joys of life or dejected and morose. Her ups got higher and more frequent, without a doubt, but her lows were erratic and illogical. Chatroom personal politics, perhaps. She exposed her spirit out there, and Louisa's psychism made her extra sensitive. I suggested the use of astral armor to her once, and she looked at me surprised and said, "There's nothing in the universe that can harm me." She was on a high at the time, naturally. She said it with such guileless conviction that I almost believed her. It didn't occur to me that she might get herself into trouble out there. Most children have computers nowadays, if not the telepathic abilities and astral portals that went with it in Louisa's case. She had such an old head on her shoulders. She wasn't a child, not really. She is the most psychically adept girl I have ever encountered, easily outstripping her old mammon by the age of 15. To be honest, I am somewhat in awe of Louisa, and have always considered myself blessed to have been given her. Like Julian after her, the child is educating the parent. They are old ones whose very growth I have become a part of. I let Louisa get on with it. As I pottered around the living room one evening, tidying up abandoned crisp packets and homework, I looked up to find Louisa emerging over the staircase with her back stretched along the ceiling, her dusky locks panning out as if in water. She floated above me, weed-like whorls of hair swimming in air, a dark Ophelia, a beatific smile on her supernaturally serene face. When she saw me, she looked at her earthly mother with the will to communicate. The laser green which shot from those pupils nearly seared my soul asunder. Such was the potency of its Ouroboros life power. She was 16 at the time and had been practicing. She knew the astral and yesodic ropes, and she knew that I knew she did. There was something utterly confident and undaughterly about her. I was relieved that she remembered who I was. He's come back, Mammon. He's come back to me, she exclaimed, before returning to her telepathing. I could see the black and crimson heart on her sleeve, and it was whole again. What form he had taken, Louisa did not describe, but that she had rediscovered one of her soul bondsmen, there could be no doubt. The next few weeks were fraught. Ben loathed to see his child in the grip of an obsession, especially one with such obvious effects and such tenuous cause. She was so beautiful, so radiant, however, that it was impossible to wholly object to this transformation. Her entire character was animated, and I noted again what I have learned in the past, that life without deep love is no life at all. She became magnetized again and again as she logged on to this reciprocal entity. Worry fled from her, self-consciousness became self-appreciation, her parchment soul unraveled and revealed its sigils, and she began to understand. She floated through the house like a pre-Raphaelite goddess in a laudanum dream in which anything is possible. Her music changed. The fierce and morbid was surmounted by a high melodic vocal, the sound of the siren. She was calling her beloved to her island. The effects of 16 years on the physical plane, the matter she had accumulated, its shapes and sounds and Louisa resonances. At its epicenter, her body, Louisa's slender, glowing, sacred body. Every morning before school, her first action would be to log on to receive messages from her distant beloved. She'd caught him in the Ethernet, in a trawling system more refined than simple telepathy, one with clearer signs and symbols. The modern world has given much to the ancient ones, and science has been a Class A aid to witchcraft. Both clauses apply vice versa, of course. Before she told me so, I didn't assume it was a man. I am a modern mother, never the cloistered smothering type. But there were other things I did assume, because I trusted Louisa's psychism and the gods that had led her to this amazing interaction with. His name was Daleth. His nom de plume, anyway. Strange choice for a boy, if taken kabbalistically. But hey, chances are he was really a Kev or a Dwayne or a... Daleth or not, I trusted that he was trustworthy. Don't ask me why. Very laissez-faire of me, I know. My brain should have been stomping with club-footed ghouls of maternal doubt, but it wasn't. I was fascinated and delighted to see Louisa cast so high, so powerfully. Every evening after school, she logged on again and spent as long as possible communicating with her lover, who turned out to be living in New York. I even allowed her to ring him a couple of times when Ben was out. They spoke for 2 hours, and she looked like a goddess afterwards. She was obsessed with the 5-hour time lag, obsessed with the physical manifestation of the spiritual alchemy they performed via their screens, and, way beyond that, up on the astral where their spirits had always been together, kin as they were. She was barely present when she was with us. "Where are you going?" I asked. "To dance amongst the stars," she laughed. What mother could resist that? Between North London and New York, the spiritual freeway vibrated with brightly lit etheric traffic. Louisa's dark luster spread through the house, causing Julian to comment. "One assumes your Gothic attire to be ironic, Louisa, as your soul shines clearly through its artificial cobwebs, and your ardour illuminates its most tenacious blackness. You appear to be a contradiction in terms." Yes, he really does speak like that. Ben and Rosa frequently attempt to encourage him to adopt a more modern style, but then, when I hear how his contemporaries speak, in affected ghetto patois, I prefer his arcane approach. Spiritual energy will only take the carnate so far. Sooner or later, all must be grounded. Daleth and Louisa wanted to meet. More JPEGs were exchanged. Louisa invited me to look at one. My heart stopped when I saw him. A face framed by long dark hair, unnervingly familiar, only ravaged. A once pretty visage torn by decadence, tortured by pleasure, and I suspected, pleasured by pain. Dark, burning eyes, not quite psychopathic, but certainly mesmeric. A mouth sensual in shape and cruel in line. Instinctively, I projected a banishing pentagram at him. The screen flickered, and Louisa glanced at me questioningly. She felt my antipathy, but was still too full of enthusiasm and hope to fully register it. She was under glamour. "Isn't he amazing?" she gushed. I tried to keep my voice steady. "How old is he, Louisa, darling?" I asked. Louisa flushed a little, and a barrier came up between us. "I would have thought that would be the last question you'd ask," she retorted. "What does it matter how old his body is?" It was at this point that I realized there are 1 or 2 flaws in the way that I've raised my children. Spiritually accurate, perhaps, but not always practical. "It matters when you're planning on getting your body embroiled with his," I replied, causing her to blush again. "How old is he, Louisa?" Her lips tightened. "Tell me." No reply. "Tell me." "He was born in 1947 this time, as if it mattered." "He's older than your father," I cried. I'm older than my father, as you well know, she replied reasonably. I was caught in an impasse entirely of my own construction. Instantly, I caught the overview. Louisa and Daleth had exchanged intimacies over the internet, such as most marriages are never blessed with, including my own, as Benjamin is no esotericist. They had dipped their toes in the tides of one another's psyches, just testing. Then, when the waters proved friendly, they'd waded in, shedding convention as they went, and finally they'd taken the plunge. Total submergence in one another, Louisa's high tide on the ceiling, the bliss of empathy, of union. It took weeks for Louisa to climb back down psychically. However, having sensed the essence of this man Daleth, I was sure that Louisa was about to drown. Where could we go from here? Louisa was in love with a man 3 times her age, and worse, one whose very image made my flesh crawl. I became sensitized to his presence, could see his grubby hands all over my responsive daughter's body, all layers of which were reaching back out to him, teasing, promising, letting him in. It was psychic pornography. Yet there was no doubt that what she perceived was true. They had a link from another life. Had possibly been lovers or even handfasted then. It was completely karmic. So, should I intervene, as any mother should, or let them be, as ought a priestess? It didn't take me long to make up my mind, I'm afraid. When Louisa approached me that night in a hanging around my hems kind of way, I knew she was seeking my sympathy and support, the only support for Daleth she was likely to get in this house. She began making noises, hints about her beloved Daleth coming to London, staying in a hotel where perhaps she might visit him. I have always been a progressive parent, keen that my offspring experience the unusual and the just plain fun, but this was one party Louisa was not going to go to. Over my dead bodies. There. It was out before I even had the chance to analyze it. It was gut reaction, primal instinct. Louisa would never know how close I had come to colluding with her before this moment, but now that it was said, I knew it was the only stance I could sensibly take. Louisa's face dropped. It was horrible to see the panic and disappointment beginning to creep into her expression. I only told you the truth because I thought you'd understand, she cried desperately. Are you going to punish me now for being honest with you? Because I could have, you know. I could have just snuck out to meet him, or pretended he was the same age as me. You know how easily I could have photoshopped that image. Mummin, please don't let me down now. He's the most important and wonderful thing that's ever happened to me in this life. Her eyes were smarting with tears, and had reached that brilliant emerald, set off by the hint of red now appearing in the orbs, which is unearthly in its intensity. When she cried like this at nursery school, other children had hidden behind chairs. She gazed at me beseechingly. She was wondering whether I was going to betray her, wondering whether all of my spiritual values were just bullshit. I could read the thoughts at the front of her mind, see her darkly painted lips twitching to deliver them. But she didn't want to. What she wanted, what she was praying for, was for me to go, "Oh, all right then. I'll help you be with this man from your past." It was never going to happen. Louisa, there is no way on earth that I'm going to help you have a relationship with this man. It isn't merely his age, darling. There's just something about him I don't like. My own eyes were filling, but I had to help Louisa through this realization before I could indulge in my own mixed emotions. I had to sound firm, definite. My daughter glowered at me. "Well, this is a bloody wonderful time to mention it, Anastasia," she yelled. Now when I'm completely in love with him. Now, when he's wanting to meet me and I've practically promised myself to him already. Then she was so angry and disbelieving that she could no longer choke out the words. She rested for a moment, with her head in her arms against the wall, her lustrous dark hair snaking down her back, her thin frame shaking. She cast me one furious look and screamed, "You are forcing me to betray you!" With this, she stormed out of the room. A moment later, blasts of dark, hateful music were rattling every window frame in the house. Well, I murmured to myself, she's not that different to other teenagers after all. I'd better lock the Kali room. I was desperate for Ben to get in that evening. I was shaken by my own cruelty to Louisa. Her emotional world, the foundation of her recent psychological progression, was going to crumble unless she could carry on this affair with Delith. It was deep and passionate and spiritually significant, whatever the logistics might be. I should never have allowed it to get so far. But how does one police one's children's emotions? Impossible, of course. And I could barely have sat over her night after night, in those times when she was exchanging energy with Daleth. All spirits have to learn to walk psychologically as well as physically, and there will always be breakages. I wanted Ben's solid good sense behind me. I wanted to forget that there was any such thing as the karmic. Ben was looking pale when he came in. He usually likes to sit in the garden after work, soaking up the evening's rays, and thus maintains a fairly healthy tan despite long hours in the operating theatre. Weekends often find us out on the balcony of our bedroom, especially now that it's spring, sipping whiskey or red wine at the rickety iron table, holding our faces up to the sun like flowers. We have a peaceful and good marriage compared to many, despite the disparities in our beliefs. I feel that Ben may be holding out against the spiritual truths which surround him daily, because we, the family, need his grounding energy to keep us on this planet. Not Rosa, perhaps, though her time will come, but Louisa and Julian and I, we actually require Ben not to get onto our wavelength. Isn't that funny? If he ever did, with the whole of his heart and mind, our anchor would become unstuck, and we'd fly back into the vortex of primal chaos, I'm sure of it. So I'm glad he's so stubborn, so no-nonsense compared to us. But tonight, he seemed drawn. I didn't fancy my chances at explaining Louisa's side of the story. I offered him a drink. Outside or in, I asked with false cheeriness as I poured 2 large scotches over ice. Inside, he said immediately. I've seen enough of death for one day. I looked at him and saw that he was really exhausted, upset. He had lost a patient, clearly. Who was it? I asked gently. He took a deep swig of his whiskey and rocked the glass contemplatively so that the ice tinkled against its sides. A girl, he answered tensely. About Louisa's age, she'd been assaulted and stabbed. We did what we could. Have you ever noticed that when a particular theme is pressing, everything around you seems to echo it? Sometimes this is helpful, but today it most definitely was not. I hope to goodness that Louisa herself would not approach the subject with Ben tonight. Where are the kids? He asked, as if thoughts of this girl had suddenly made him want to take stock of his own family, which they most probably had. I sank down beside him into the deep black couch with its glimmering oriental cushions, trying to seem relaxed. Rosa's out with Bonnie, Julian's at chemistry club, and Louisa's in her room. At which point I noticed that the upstairs oral chaos of thrash metal had stopped. A sudden wave of doubt and fear hit me. I think, hang on while I go and check. Why do you want to check? Asked Ben. Come on, you've only just sat down. Louisa was usually up there for hours on end, after all, ensconced in her room. But the silence was unnerving me. I put my glass on a small teak table and sprang to my feet. No particular reason, I lied. I'd just like to know where my eldest daughter has got to. I knew I sounded odd, but all I could think about was our argument earlier. Suddenly, it was of paramount importance that I come to some sort of peaceful conclusion with her. I rushed up the stairs to avoid his questioning look. In Louisa's room, the black satin curtain billowed in the breeze. The window was wide open. I walked up to it in a panic and looked out. Nobody on the drainpipe. There were tracks in the gravel of the driveway, but those could have been Ben coming in or Rosa going out or... "Can I help you, Anastasia?" came a small, perfectly cold voice from behind me. I jumped almost guiltily and swung round. Louisa was sitting cross-legged on her bed, a tarot reading spread out before her. "Please don't call me Anastasia, darling," I said. "Please don't call me darling, Anastasia," she replied. I stared at her, shocked. She had lost her girlishness and was now the Queen of Swords, aloof, clad in quiet sorrow, incalculably older. It was not a pleasant transformation. "You are doing this to me," was the silent accusation. I glanced around the room. Above her workbench, the saturnine visage of Daleth loomed at us from her computer desktop. The eyes were alive. I resisted the urge to banish him. Louisa would have noticed in an instant. "As you can tell, we're already together in every way but one," she stated calmly. I realize that I am going to get no support from you or Daddy in this endeavor. She waved the card from the obstacles position, the lovers, and returned it to its place. But I'm now old enough to marry, and I am more than grown up, as you know. So I am telling you now that neither you nor anyone else will prevent me from being with Daleth as the gods intend. I've just been communicating with him, and he's coming to London next week. She plucked the devil card from the immediate future and waved it triumphantly at me. I know you know what this means, she sneered. Could this really be my beloved daughter? I stared at her, seeking the influence of some other I could blame. But though Daleth was all over her aura, I could see that the motivations were her own. A hot flush of anger suffused my face, and I forgot myself. Thinking of going back to your old career, are you, Louisa? I sniped before I could stop myself. Back to the bon ton of the Moulin Rouge, entertaining men old enough to be your grandfather? I paused, meeting her green eyes with my own, intent on my protective fury. Is that what we brought you up here for, in this lovely house with everything you could possibly want, so that you could repeat all your old mistakes and throw your life away on some filthy, perverse old man? I almost spat the last words. I could feel Daleth's etheric tendrils tingling against my skin, so that the hairs on my arms and at the back of my neck rose up in resistance. Louisa's face was the very picture of outrage, and so young and yet so old at the same time. How dare you judge me? Carefully controlled staccato sentence, each word with a flint at its heart. You're no better than I am, and you did it too. We all do it at some time. You're letting your motherly instinct confuse you. It used to be sacred. It used to be in the name of Cybele and Inanna and Dionysius. You know that. And that's just the physical side. There's more to life than the physical shell, you know, she added sarcastically. If you put this emphasis on the body, then you're no better than any other whore. But I barely had time to absorb what she had said. In a flash, I knew that Ben was in the doorway, that he had heard at least the end of the interchange, and that he was about to make Louisa into a little girl again. What the hell is going on in here? He roared, looking from one to the other of us in outraged disbelief. Louisa, how dare you speak to your mother like that? Louisa quivered, but she said nothing. Anastasia, what on earth? He trailed off, for something had just caught his eye. It was Daleth's image on Louisa's computer. As she saw him take it in, she visibly gulped. Who in God's name is that filthy punk? He roared. So Ben has intuition too. For all he knew, it could have been the picture of some musician she liked, or an anonymous TV personality, but no. Ben took one look at that image, and he knew that his daughter was under threat. A brief pause as he mentally pasted together the information received since he had got home. Tell me, he boomed at me. Tell me. Now I knew how Louisa must have felt when I demanded the same of her. I felt guilty, implicated, yes, but also protective. I fully intended to make it sound less significant and more my fault than it actually was. Only it all came out wrong, as these things tend to when emotions are high. I wished I had my whiskey from downstairs. Well, I begun, under the scrutiny of both my alienated daughter and my suspicious, angry husband. Louisa has a friend, don't you, Louisa? Only, it's rather more complicated than that, as these things can so often be. My voice sounded sickly, I thought, wheedling. Ben had me fixed with his most sensible stare. That man's older than I am, he said dully. Don't tell me you were thinking of getting involved with him, Louisa, or that you already are? Are you pregnant? Absolute horror in his face as he said this. No, she replied quickly. I haven't even met him yet. Yes, it's all rather a fuss over nothing, darling, I crooned. Louisa had some silly idea that she was going to meet up with this chap when he comes over from America next week, and I've told her that she can't. I'm afraid we've had a bit of a falling out over it, haven't we, Lou? But we'll muddle through, I'm sure. Louisa simply needs to tell this Daleth that she can keep on writing, but that they cannot possibly meet until she's at least 18. We can't tell her what to do then, I added to Ben. Oh yes, we can, for as long as she's under my roof, came the classic response. Then I shan't be, said Louisa simply. We both stopped and looked at her. She was still sitting cross-legged on the bed, her hair tumbling into her lap, looking like a pixie in her stripy tights, and calmer than either of us wanted. There was grown-up resolve in her face, and Ben saw it. "You can't stop me," she added coldly. "He's coming over to see me next week, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to keep us apart. We're inevitable. It's not just some teenage crush, you know. It's ultimate spiritual union. It's—" "That's enough," interrupted Ben. "Stop this nonsense, Louisa." My love-stricken daughter and I were both rattled by the crude anger in his voice. She gazed at him, as if he was of some species she was yet to identify, as he commanded me to shut the window and lock it. Slowly, confused by divided loyalties, but unable to argue with Ben when he's in this mood, rare but impenetrable, I complied. "Give me that key. Louisa, you're not leaving this room until you swear to me that you'll give up this madness and forget about this Daleth, and I'll have this." And to our horror, he ripped the computer connection from the back of the monitor and picked up the metal box. Its icon winced and vanished. "It's for your own good, Louisa," he said quietly. Now he simply looked exhausted. "You have no idea what goes on out there, what these men can do." He was close to tears as he locked the door from the outside. I knew that he was thinking of the injuries inflicted on that other girl. "You'll thank us for this when you're older," was the last thing he said to her before we imprisoned our daughter. When Julian came in from chemistry club, he reeked of sulfur. I felt as if I was in some obscure hell. Rosa was sullen after a tiff with her best friend Bonnie Val, who apparently had accused her of spending more time with her boyfriend than with her. Bonnie Val was so named because Ben delivered her when my friend Tara, Bonnie's mother, went into labor prematurely. I think she might have reconsidered the name had she known that we would end up living virtually in one another's homes, but as it stood, Rosa de Bonneval and Bonneval Richards were inseparable best friends. "I hate her," whinged Rosa. "She's jealous of me and Blue." She stared into her supper, pizza from the local Italian because I'd had no time to cook. Like the rest of us, she had little appetite for it. Eyeing an olive, which reminded her of Bonnie Val's green army trousers that they'd bought together in Camden Town, she relented. "I don't really hate her," she muttered. Ben sat at the top of the table looking grim. Rosa was trying to please him as usual, passing the salad bowl with a smile and offering to top up his wine and other little attentions which made her remind me of a geisha. She always was a daddy's girl, and tonight I was glad. Normality was exactly what this household needed. Julian sipped at his wine. He was too mature for us to refuse him a glass, and we knew he would never go beyond what was comfortable to him, and eyed me over its chunky blue rim. "And where is our dear Louisa tonight, Maman?" he asked. "Glued to the internet again, one assumes. Shall we save her a slice of this delectable Fiorentina? We all know how fond she is of spinach." His words were innocent, his thoughtfulness genuine. His intuition was clearly tainted by sulfur. I believe that foul stench generally produces such an effect, as he was not, like me, being tortured by the pungent resentment emanating from Louisa's room. As for me, I could barely think of anything but her face, her eyes glowing green in the dark. "Louisa is grounded," Ben announced to the family. Rosa's mouth opened as she slowly put her knife and fork down. She seemed like a sitcom character, I thought, with her pointed gestures and exaggerated expressions of surprise, anticipation. Julian raised his eyebrows beneath their flop of blonde fringe. He waited intelligently for the explanation. "What?" shrieked Rosa. "Louisa?" She was almost giggling, which jarred with me. "What's she done?" Rosa was enjoying this. Louisa was an oddity to Rosa, someone who could not fulfill the functions she would have loved in a sister. Rosa wanted someone to shop with, to go to the cinema with, a sister who would smoke illicit cigarettes out of an opened window and gossip about boys. These things she did with Bonnieval. What she got from Louisa was an intensity she didn't understand, a language she did not wish to speak. Louisa was cool in that she looked good. Rosa's friends admired her, and her music was okay, but she was too quiet, too weird. Louisa did crazy stuff, like walking round the Lebanon Circle at night talking to the spirits. She did occult experiments in her room, which Rosa hated. And despite all of this, she got more respect from Mum and Julian than Rosa could in a million years. They both said Louisa had talents. "Go on, what has she done?" repeated Rosa after a pause during which Ben drained half his glass of Beaujolais. "Louisa is involved with an undesirable," he pronounced, as is giving a terminal diagnosis to distressed relatives. He twirled his wine glass with his fingers, but at one point it stuck on them and almost spilled. He adjusted it with the swift skill of the master surgeon that he is. "Some freak on the internet has convinced her she's his girlfriend, or what you might call," he glanced at me and Julian, "her soulmate. She has to get it out of her system, and until she does, I want neither of you, Rosa and Julian, going near her." He looked at the twins one by one, assessing their loyalty. "Julian, you may deliver food and messages to your sister, but if you try to aid her in this madness, you can consider your chances of going to Oxford null and void." These were harsh words which shocked us all. They also said much about how Ben viewed the relationships between his children. I hoped Rosa didn't notice it. She could be in therapy for years if she did. He sighed and looked at us all beseechingly, despite his best effort at being the indomitable father. "This sounds unreasonable, I know, but you have no idea of the evil there is out there. I don't want my eldest daughter to die like a dog." This image pressed itself into our taut minds. Each of us was thinking that he was being over the top, yet all of us knew that he lives on the outside, dealing with tragedy daily. We did not wish to hurt him with any hint of flippancy. "Who is this guy?" asked Rosa, sounding dangerously impressed. We all looked at her, and she blushed. She could feel the antipathy flowing from me, yet could barely understand why her lightness was an insult. "Sorry," she said sarcastically as defense. "Sorry I spoke." Ben gave her a faint, fond smile, and she rallied. That girl is a vampire for her father's affections, I thought again. I glanced at my son. Julian was pale, his aura tight. His one dream, his only dream, was of going to Oxford University, where he could study politics, the subject dearest to him. But this was merely in the back of his mind. The forefront was vivid with concern over Louisa, and what could have elicited this dire threat, and how she and the pater had come to be in this parlous situation. It simply wasn't civilized, and he adores Louisa. The thought of her trapped in her room was akin to finding her promised to the amphitheatre. "What lions await her?" he asked. We're used to his idioms and caught his mental image instantly. Is she firm in her belief? Perhaps if so, we ought to take her opinions into account. He could not accept that his clever elder sister was being overruled by the parents in so brutal a fashion. Rosa poured more wine into her father's glass and gave me a questioning look. I nodded, and mine too was refilled. I tried to smile at her, but she was already back in her seat and looking at Ben. I could feel Louisa upstairs, her frustration, her resentment, the deepness of her soul. She would cast spells to attain her ends, I knew that. She would be up there now thinking about invoking Kali, Krishna, Radha to get her back to Dalith. Perhaps Black Isis too, if she's really got the virus. "Louisa is a very intelligent girl," said Ben carefully, "as you all know. I am happy to say that every member of my family has an IQ of which I can be truly proud." Rosa smiled into her cranberry juice. "But I cannot and will not tolerate my children placing themselves in danger." Julian said nothing. I could see his mind whirring beneath his blonde flop of hair, but he did not wish to antagonize the unit. "Louisa will stay put until this man has found himself some other girl to play around with." He paused. "The man's a paedophile," he almost spat. There isn't much that one can reply to that, especially in this postal district. Besides, it was true that Louisa was still a girl, and her suitor was a lot older, even if only physically. May as well sound as if you're defending Satan himself. And even that might be easier. Ben is only human, after all, and he had a point, as he always does. We all went to bed with indigestion that night, and when the owl hooted from the cedar, Ben stirred in his sleep and shouted. He has never done that before. I shouldn't tell you what he said, as it's personal, but I'm trying to relate the story with as much accuracy as possible. You can take from it what you will. What he yelled in his slumber was, "Be gone!" Was my family nest really under threat? I knew that these things were happening because my eldest child had reached maturity. I did not want her to leave either, and so I participated in the barbaric act for which Louisa would probably never forgive me. Goddess, please give me strength to keep my children safe. The next few days were characterized by the continual playing of my old Sisters of Mercy 12-inch, Valentine, by Louisa, who had long ago laid claim to the box set I had cherished when it first came out. The slow rhythm of the drum machine, interspaced by Andrew Eldritch's lugubrious vocals, will forevermore remind me of that inauspicious etheric lover of Louisa's. Most unfair, as I've liked the sisters for years. Louisa must have known she was driving me nuts by putting it on repeat. No doubt she thought it nothing in comparison to her own mental anguish. It was the Easter holidays, and Louisa was completely grounded except to attend her Saturday job at Malinowski's, the local antiquarian bookstore. I had assumed they had nothing as modern as a computer on the premises, and Ben or I picked her up immediately after work. She was sullen and defiant, though still reasonably charged up psychically. I could tell that she was plotting. Of course, there was nothing we could do to keep Louisa and Daleth from meeting up on the astral plane, which they continued to do nightly. Louisa had conveyed the news to him that she was not able to meet him, and I worried that she would broadcast the address of our home if she hadn't already done so. I set up a psychic security network around the house and garden, a reinforced one, which would forewarn me of Daleth's presence, both astral and physical. I had noticed that his apparitions were become fainter since Louisa's incarceration began. About 2 weeks into this unpleasant episode, I went up in the morning to take Louisa yogurt, fruit and coffee, and found an old woman lying on her bed. No, it was Louisa, lying there in her black shift, staring at the ceiling. But her face had aged, and there was a grey streak in her long locks. She greeted me warily. I perceived in an instant that Daleth had cut her off psychically. "Darling," I said. "He's gone," she replied unnecessarily. Her beauty had gone with him. She looked flat and one-dimensional, lacking in any kind of luster. My heart went out to her. She and Daleth had been flying so high and so fast together that this crash would shatter her, I knew. The layers of her aura were a mess. Astrally, she was mangled. I set the food down and sat on the edge of her bed. She did not respond, probably lacking the energy to do so. My stomach felt as though there was a meteorite freezing in it. I knew it would be a very long time before I saw my daughter levitate again. Immediately I set to placing my hands in her aura and trying to revitalize it. I worked through her chakras one by one. They were in splinters. Louisa just lay there, with her eyes shut, tears streaming from the corners of her eyes. She accepted the energy, but it was one drop of water in a vast, arid desert. Her kundalini was crippled. She could not speak. I realized that he must have rejected her, bored no doubt by the prospect of having to wait to satisfy the physical side of their interaction. He had, it transpired, some other little hottie on the go now. Louisa lay slain. It took a lot of stitching to patch my little French symbolist's rag doll back together. The very sight of Highgate Cemetery made her cry, which was awkward as her room overlooks it, as does much of the house. We spent a great deal of time trying to reinfuse her with her own soul. She had chosen to dissociate from her body, which is why her hair streaked grey and her face lost its radiance. Mr. Malinowski, the old bookseller for whom she worked at weekends, paid us several visits, as did the lovely Lauren, the manageress of the shop. The rituals we used will be related elsewhere, when I have more time to tell of the many events that occur in this blessed place. Youth is resilient, and thankfully Louisa's physical heart was strong enough to withstand what would have killed an older woman. Let's just call it an etheric hitch.